Okay, it is lesson 10. Wow, folks, 4 weeks left to go in this crazy journey for you guys. How are you feeling about that? Can you believe it that you only got 4 weeks left? It's terrifying. Yes, understandable. I would hope there's some degree of satisfaction when you think about how far you've come in really a pretty short time. Think about what you knew when you arrived and think about what you guys are capable of doing now. It's really amazing. So we'll just have a quick look at what our next few weeks look like here. So today we're going to talk about entrepreneurship and client relations. So a few things around running your own business and I want to have a lot of conversation. Today's class is mostly conversation focused about dealing with clients. And I want to share some really common scenarios, either things that are really common in the world of web design and web development, as well as experience I've had in my own kind of 2 decade career in this industry. And we can have some conversation around some of those scenarios. Next week, we're going to talk about quality assurance, which was something Sean touched on some in his presentation. And then our second last class in 2 weeks, we're going to look at kind of this phase leading up to launch. So what are we doing both before, during, and after putting an application into production where it's live with real users using it. And then our final class in 3 weeks from now will be the prototype demos. So I want to talk about a number of different scenarios today. I'm going to encourage you, please use the chat or use your microphone, maybe simpler. The first scenario I want to talk about, thing I want to do today, we want to look at build versus buy scenarios. And this is a really common challenge that gets put to us in almost every project. When do we buy or use an existing either software or service? When do we create our own? So we're going to talk around some of those considerations because it's something that comes up in virtually every project that we do. And probably some of you have even faced that in the project we're doing, in the Man Up project. We're then going to talk about freelance work and some of the things, some of the requirements and resources involved if you decide you want to work for yourself. And then we're going to spend a bunch of time looking at client scenarios. So, first of all, we'll ask this question, thinking about the Man Up project. In your decision about build, there's actually three options. We talked about, I mentioned it as build versus buy, but there's actually build, there's buy, and then there's buy and customize. In terms of your Man Up project, how many of you have already had this discussion about some component of the project? Do we go and find something out there that already exists, or do we build it ourselves? So use your mic or use the chat let me know if you've already had a conversation around this in your own project. Okay, so Maggie, your team would look at buying a chatbot or using a chatbot. Yeah, it's really complex to build. Okay, thanks. Anybody else? Has your team had any conversation about going to find pre-existing components for the Man Up project? And if so, what components were they? Well, let's look at these options in more detail. Let's start with kind of what we're mostly training you to do, which is to build all of the code. Come on, Blackboard, you can do it. Okay, well, I thought this would go on Blackboard. Maybe not. That's okay. I've got a solution for that. We'll just use another interface. So let's talk first about building all the code ourselves. What are some of the benefits or reasons to write your own code in a web project? Use the chat or use your mic. Absolutely. Our own code is easier for us to understand than other people's code. Yep. What are some other advantages to building things yourself? Okay, absolutely. Thanks, Rachel. So you've got a lot more control over it, for sure. Great point. Why else would you consider, or what are some of the other reasons to write your own code? What about your client needs or your application requirements? This is kind of related to what Rachel's saying. What about from like a customer satisfaction perspective? What's the benefit of writing your own code? Okay, that's a good point, Justin. So I'll add that as well, right? Oops. Okay, I don't know why I can't copy from the chat, but Justin says you're building something specific and it is hard to find something out there. Very good point. A lot of organizations have really custom needs. So the only way to build an application that does what they want is to create a custom app that we're not going to be able to go and find something. What about on an ongoing basis? So thinking not only of when we're building the application, but let's say, we build something and it takes us several months to build, we launch it into production, people start using the application. There's another huge benefit afterwards for writing our own code. Why is this kind of beneficial in the long run? To work with our own code base once an application is in production and being used potentially by lots of people. I mean, once you launch an application, do you just sort of get paid and wash your hands of it? What's the typical future expectation? Okay, that's a really good point. Yep, that wasn't what I was thinking of, but that's an excellent point. So we can reuse or replicate our own code easily. And what's another big benefit into the future? Okay, so Young says it costs less than buying solutions. So Young, let's come back to that one. That's an interesting question. Let's come back to cost. Okay, yes, we're not paying outside sources. True. What about the ability to maintain or update? Which method is going to be easier if you need to make changes, either fix bugs or add new features or make changes later? Is that going to be easier with your own code or with an application that you buy? This is one of the most important considerations in this conversation. If I was paying you to go and update a project, right, thank you, Maggie. So this is an important consideration, right? It's not only about building the application and getting it launched, but our job doesn't end there. And we'll talk more about this in a couple of weeks. If our applications are being used, then we're probably going to have more work to keep them up to date, to make changes, to bug fix. That's going to be way easier. It's so much easier to change your own code than to change code someone else wrote. So those are most of the advantages. What about the disadvantages? What are some of the negatives? I mean, think of Maggie's example that she gave. She said her team is using, you found a chatbot, right? So time. You're going to spend a lot of time figuring out just, what the requirements are and how to implement them, how to meet those. Yep. What else is a drawback of writing your own code? This kind of comes back, So Young, to the point you made earlier. So it's related to time and cost. In general, which is more expensive, to build things from scratch by yourself or to use existing software or services? If I asked you to give me the cheapest working content management system you could, would you build it? Or would you use an existing one? Yes, it does depend on what's needed. That's true. To a point. Well, let's go back to your example of a chat bot. Is it going to be cheaper for you to use an existing chat solution or for you to create your own?
It would be easier to use a pre-built just because of the time allotted to figuring out how to build a chatbot.
Right. So typically, not always, but rarely can you build something from scratch that's cheaper than a pre-built solution that you can buy. Okay, so you do understand it's easier to update. We can replicate it. We can customize it. But typically, all those things take more time. And if they take more time, they're more expensive. So, what about just buying? See if Blackboard's back up. Okay. So, what about buying a solution? What are some of the benefits? What are some of the benefits to buying an existing service component as opposed to creating it yourself? That's the. Yep. So we know it works because we can typically do a demonstration of it and see it. It's been tested. Ah, that's a good one, Justin. It may come with support. So things like documentation, help forums, live chat, right? Some of these things may already exist. So if we have problems with it, we have places to go. So customer service, documentation, updates and patches, right? It may have all of these things. Any other reasons to buy an existing solution? Right? Typically, thanks, Janelle, right? It might take some time to source a solution, but if we can find one and just plug it in and it works, that's typically going to take a lot less time than it will to code it and test our own. So what about cost then? Obviously, there's some variables, but if our responsibility is to give our client the best solution we can for the least amount of money in the least amount of time, then what about cost? Is that typically an advantage or a disadvantage of buying an existing solution? I guess we'd say buy or use. If your client has a really limited budget, are you going to build them or are you going to buy something? So it's usually more cost effective to go and find an existing solution because of the time. That's right, as Janelle and Maggie are saying. To go and find something and get it working is usually going to take less time, as well as the testing is already built into it, so it's going to be more effective. We don't necessarily need to list the cons because it's kind of the opposite of the pros here, right? So the cons are we don't know the code well or at all, difficult to update, may not work exactly how a client wants. So what about the last scenario? This is kind of like a hybrid of the two, right? What about buying something and then customizing it? So for example, I had a customer years ago, they wanted an e-commerce site, they were selling photo gifts, but part of the process was when a user picked a product, they could upload a photo that they had, and we could actually render the photo on top of the product, and they could size it and move it around so they could actually see. So that it was mostly a standard shopping cart, but that piece was custom. Right? But he said it doesn't make sense to build. I can find a full shopping cart solution. I only need to customize a couple pieces of it. So what are the benefits of that? Okay, and yep, so we get that we can control, but we have the ability to make changes. It's a way of personalizing something that's already functional. Yep. What about the negatives of buying and customizing? So, I mean, these two, this gets around a lot of the negatives of the first two. It's really easy to break someone else's code. Yep. What else is a downside of using an existing software or service, but then customizing it to work the way you want? Aside from the fact that we can break it. Yep, we can affect the performance. What about making updates? Oh, okay, right, Rachel, that's a huge one. Just the learning curve is typically massive. In order to figure out how someone else's code works, in order so that we can change it, is really difficult. And it's extremely time consuming. I'll just add, it could take lots of time. So which of these do you think is actually the most expensive? If we had to order them from cheapest to most expensive, which one do you think typically winds up being? How would you order these from 1, 2 to 3? So build, buy, or buy and customize. Which is actually the most expensive, according to research? What do you think? Maggie says buy and customize is the most expensive. Okay. Let's get some other opinions. What do you think? Justin says build is the cheapest, then buy, and then buy and customize. Okay. Like to get a few other opinions. What's the cheapest? What's the most expensive? Not in all cases, but generally. Oh, so Justin, you said build is most expensive, then buy and customize, and then buy. Okay. No, you. In reality, and this is borne by research, there's a big danger with buy and customize. At the upfront, it has the potential to give the customer everything they want. In order, research shows buying an existing solution is and implement as is. This is the least expensive solution. In general, not in all cases, but in general, this is the most cost-effective way. So if you know there's an existing service, API, software as a service, or piece of software that does what your customer wants, it's tested, it has support, this is usually the least expensive way to go. If they have custom needs, or they're going to require a lot of changes and updates on an ongoing basis, then we're better to build ourselves. That's typically more expensive though. The most expensive is generally this. And that's for the reasons that you've outlined. It's easy to break. So we make a change, and when we're not working in our own code base, it's really easy for that change to have cascading effects and affect other areas of the application that we don't understand. There's a big learning curve in trying to understand how someone else's code base works and then make changes to it. So in the long run, it's most expensive. And I've actually experienced this in my own career where I had a client who wanted us to customize an existing solution. The client found a software package that they liked, but it didn't do a few things. So they wanted us to customize it. And then for their business, we also made a separate portal for like their dealers and agents. And that was very custom. So we just built that from scratch. But some of the functionality was shared between the two applications, the customized solution and then the one we built. And over time, whenever we had to make changes in the customized solution, it probably took 4 or 5 times as much time to add and test the same feature into someone else's solution as it did to add this feature to our own solution. So while this seemed like a good idea up front, because the customer didn't want to pay for us to build a custom solution from scratch, they figured it would be cheaper to do this. Over time, this cost far more money. Because we did work for this customer for over 10 years on the project, constantly updating. And over time, our own custom solution was much easier and less expensive to maintain and update. So there isn't necessarily a right and a wrong here. I'll copy this into Blackboard. But before you rush ahead and just assume you should always build everything, you should be considering these things. Okay, and as I said, you may be considering some of these things even in the Man Up project. What do we code? What do we buy? I would generally advise, in my experience, staying away from buying an existing solution and then trying to take it apart. If there isn't an existing solution that does exactly, and when you do this, you have to show a demo to your customer. If we can buy it, it's cheaper, but here's what it does, here's how it works. Are you happy with this? If you're not happy with this, then we'll build it. Yeah, you're going to spend more money. It's going to take longer, but you're going to get what you want. So I typically will show customers solutions that may work and let them decide, does this meet their needs? I've learned to stay away from buying and customizing. It's too complicated, it's too time consuming, and ultimately it's too expensive. So I recommend staying away from this option as much as you can. Okay, how many people are here? Let's see. Our participant list. So we've got a dozen. Okay, for this, we're going to discussion. Just going to put you in breakout groups. I'm just going to assign them randomly. You can chat with some other people today. So here's your task. We're going to talk about starting up your own web development business. So I'm going to put you in breakout. So maybe have 3 breakout rooms. I'll pause the recording. Maybe give you about 10 minutes. I'll put the task in the chat as well, but you can see it on Blackboard. I want you to just make a list of all the things you would need to do if you are going to start up your own company. Maybe you're not going to do it tomorrow, but let's imagine 5 years, 10 years down the road, you've got lots of experience, lots of connections, you're tired of working for other people, and you want to go out on your own. What things will you need to do in order to get started? So I'm going to pause the recording and I'll create some breakout groups. Give me about 10 minutes for this conversation. And like to hear from each group. Maybe if you want to just share 3 or 4, I could ask each group just to share, you can use the chat. Share 3 or 4 items from your list. You don't have to share the entire list. So what would you be doing in setting up your own freelance web development business? So put 3 or 4 items from your list in the chat and I will share them onto Blackboard. Okay, thanks, Chanel. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, you need some sort of, you need a website. I'll add to this, you need a domain. You need to find a good domain name for your business. What else did you talk about in your breakout groups? Okay. Yeah, you need to figure out how much you're going to charge. You got to come up with your setup fees, your HST registration. So Young said, we want to set up who are our target market. Yeah, do we have, thanks Rachel, marketing materials? Yes, Inder, that's right. Our site, we need to make sure it's responsive. Everything works well on our portfolio, our website for mobile devices. Absolutely. Was there anything else you guys had on your list? It's a good list so far. Okay, thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, unless you're working 24/7, you need to figure out when are you open. You want to create those expectations. Okay, Maggie, that's a really important one. Right? Figuring out a timeline, or we used to call this pipeline. So first company I worked at, we had weekly meetings and, you know, we talked about we had status reports on our current projects, but the business owners, they always talked about a pipeline. What did we have coming up? They tried to have 6 months worth of projects lined up at all times. because they were employing a lot of people. It wasn't enough to have work right now. We always needed to know where was the future work coming from. Yep, we need to set up our ways of contact. Yep, I think we've got social media here already, but that's true. Yeah, we need to think about hardware and software. Right? What equipment might we need or software? You know, we're using a lot of free tools here at school, but you may need paid software. You know, you're probably going to need something like the Adobe Suite, which you have to pay for example. Yep. Just open it up. Anybody else? Was there anything else that came out of your discussion that you think you're going to need to do? Okay, do you need any licenses, like a small business license? Yes. Right, where are you going to work? Right, are you working from home? Do you have an office? And then what are the costs involved? Okay, potentially Ginal role assignment. Right, do you need a server? So where are you going to host this stuff? If you're building web applications, you're either going to need your own server or you're going to need to find, yes, your typography for part of your branding. So that's right, Inder. I'm going to add that up here. So that would be typography. Do you need insurance? You might need insurance. I'm going to add one no one's thought about yet. You are going to have to figure out bookkeeping. It's either something you're going to have to learn using a software package like QuickBooks or an online service like FreshBooks. You're going to have to pay a bookkeeper to do this. You got to do the accounting and keep track of your revenue and your expenses, right? Because you have to pay taxes on your income. You no longer have an employer doing that. You have to do that for yourself. Okay, so that's quite a lot of stuff. Now, there are some other considerations and some resources available for this, but that's a pretty good list. Policies. Yes, Maggie. So we're going to talk, this is one of the things we're going to talk about after the break. Protecting ourselves. So insurance is one way, but there's another important avenue for us to look at. All right, I'm going to save this list to Blackboard. If there's anything else, yes, Inder, I can add that as well. Right, we're going to want to write our content. So if there's anything else you think of over the next 10 minutes, we can add it to this list. And then we're going to do two things when we come back. We want to look at some of the resources that are here around self-employment in Ontario and in Canada. I want to talk about some of these things to make you aware of them. And then we're going to have some other discussion where I'm going to outline a bunch of common issues in dealing with clients, and we can have some small group and then kind of full class discussion around how we might respond to some of those common challenges. So it's 9:55. Let's take a 10-minute break and we'll come back at 10:05.